When I had journeyed half of our life's way, I found myself within a shadowed forest, for I had lost the path that does not stray. I hope none of you are lost. I hope you're in the right place. There were enough Dante signs out there to show you this way so that you know that you are here with us for the drama of Dante this evening. Good evening and welcome, everyone. Welcome to Fordham and welcome to our program, the 8th annual Fordham Reads Dante Lecture. It's great to see so many familiar faces in the audience and also new faces as well. My name is Angela Alima O'Donnell. I'm the Associate Director of the Curran Center for American Catholic Studies, one of the co-sponsors of Fordham Reads Dante, of the Fordham Reads Dante project, as well as tonight's lecture. So it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening and say a few words about our project and this evening's event. Many of us are aware of the Fordham Reads Dante project. In fact, a number of you are participants in this extraordinary initiative. Can I have a show of hands? Who's all here from Fordham Reads Dante? Sure. Oh, my apologies. Is that better? Okay. I'm sorry. I won't start again. I will continue, though, in this vein. So yes, we have some Fordham Reads Dante members here. About 10 years ago, the Curran Center spent 18 months reading the whole of the Commedia, and with select members of the faculty and the staff in our faculty seminar. And among our participants was Fordham's resident Dante scholar, Professor Susanna Barcella. Upon concluding our year-and-a-half journey together with Dante, Professor Barcella suggested that we join in partnership along with the Department of Modern Languages and Medieval Studies to create Fordham Reads Dante, an opportunity for members of the Fordham community and those beyond to gather each month, thank you, of the academic year to read Dante's Commedia, one canto at a time. In our meetings, we listen to the poetry of Dante in the original Italian, read by a native speaker, usually a Tuscan. We listen to it read in English translation, hear a brief introduction to the canto presented by a scholar, a Dante enthusiast, or faculty member, and then we engage in discussion. Our presenters are not all Dante experts. In fact, they represent a broad spectrum of disciplines, thus providing a number of different lenses from which to view the marvelous, multi-layered, multifaceted poem that is the Commedia. This conversation began in the spring of 2016, which I think is when you began your film, right? So, of 2016?
That's correct.
Yeah, so there's simpatico going on here in all kinds of ways. We had 1 year we had to take off, the COVID year 2020. So with the exception of that year, tonight we're marking the start of our 8th year of reading Dante together as a community. As you can tell, we're in no hurry. In proceeding at the luxuriously leisurely pace of one canto per meeting, members of the group are able to consider the artistry of the Commedia, to savor the music of Dante's language and lines, and to better understand not only what the poem means, but in the words of the great poet Jean Ciardi, how the poem means. Given this leisurely pace, and given the fact that the Commedia consists of 100 cantos, we will be at this for a while. After 7 years of gathering, we've just completed Canto 31 of Inferno, and we're looking forward to completing the first long leg of Dante's journey in December with the last canto of Inferno, an occasion that will be marked by a hell-themed costume party held on the auspicious date of Friday the 13th of December. So if you have nothing else to do on Friday the 13th of December, come dressed as your favorite hellish character. So by my reckoning, we have another 69 cantos and approximately another 12 years to go. But we are patient people. Dante was undaunted in his project of writing 14,233 lines of terza rima, so we shall follow his lead and be undaunted in reading them. From the inception of the project, our focus has been on hearing Dante, to recreate orally the original sound of the poem, for poetry is first and foremost linguistic music. In addition, we are interested in the ways in which Dante's work continues to speak to us here and now in the 21st century. 7 centuries after his death, Dante continues to be a persistent presence in the intellectual, religious, and artistic imagination of the Western world. As many of us in the audience are aware, Dante has influenced many artists, from painters to poets to novelists to filmmakers, beginning in his own era and continuing into our present moment. As an aside, I might add that I count myself among those artists who have been inspired by the Commedia. I recently published a book of poems entitled Dear Dante. I actually was just holding it in my hand, which features a conversation between myself, a 21st century Italian-American poet, and Dante, the great medieval Tuscan poet. That book grew out of my admiration for Dante's poems, but also is one of the results of the 7 years that I have spent reading the Commedia with this community of readers, thinkers, artists, and scholars. In fact, the book is dedicated to two people, Dante Alighieri, Emilio Fabro, and my colleague, Susanna Barcella, Dantista Stornaria. Susanna, in fact, has translated several of the Dante poems in Italian, into Italian, along with poet Bruno Nacci, and they were published in the Italian Poetry Review, which is the editor of whom is one of our Fordham Reads Dante members, Alessandro Pocri. So creative collaboration among members of the group takes many forms and continues. It's something that we're all grateful for. This brings us to our annual Fordham Reads Dante lecture, an event that is held in the early fall, which kicks off our new year of readings. Previous Fordham Reads Dante lectures include poet and translator Robert Pinsky, visual artist and Blake scholar Joseph Viscomi, Irish poet Michal O'Shiel, sculptor Timothy Schmaltz, and dramatist Ronald Jenkins. Tonight, we are thrilled to have as our Fordham Reads Dante speakers award-winning filmmaker Rick Burns in conversation with co-writer Riccardo Bruscagli. This marks the first time we are featuring an artist who works in the genre of film to elucidate the beauty and power of Dante's work, both by showing clips from the film and offering some context and commentary on his work. I don't know how many of you have seen Rick's film. It premiered in March on PBS. Show of hands, how many people have seen it? Okay, good, wonderful. Of course, you've all seen it. If you have seen it, you know how beautiful it is. If you're not, you are in for a treat. Dante, Inferno to Paradise brings us a fresh new way, not only of hearing Dante's poem, but of seeing the ways in which the powerful drama of the Divine Comedy enacts the dramatic ways in which our own lives unfold. After the formal presentation, Rick and Riccardo will be joined by this panel of participants in the film, including several of the actors who play characters, the very colorful characters of Dante's dramatis personae. And we will be able to engage in conversation about the project. And if time permits, we'll also invite conversation with the audience through Q&A. So thank you for your kind attention. I'm now pleased to turn the podium over to my colleague, Professor of Modern Languages, Susanna Barcella, who will introduce tonight's distinguished guests. Thank you, Susanna, and thank you.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm just doing the Cavalier Servente, and I will introduce all the people involved in this panel also. First of all, Rick Burns. Rick Burns is the documentary filmmaker and writer, and he's best known for his 8-part, 17-hour series, New York, a documentary film, who was on PBS as well, and was on air in 99, 2001, 2003. I'm sorry? Really? Like that? Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay, Burns has been writing, directing, and producing historical documentaries for over 25 years, and I think they are too close now. What if I don't use the right? I'm used to talk to students, and they're pretty, gelato. No, not gelato. So I was just saying that Rick Burns is certainly one among the filmmakers and people who changed forever the way they make documentary films. Am I right? Yes, I'm right. So he has done a lot of things, including founding Steeplechase in 1989, directed many films. I just mentioned very few because otherwise we take too long. Death and the Civil War, 2013, The Human Cost of War, and last but not least, obviously, Dante, Inferno to Paradise. I jumped a little bit, but we have that for everybody who's interested. Produced with these steeplechase he founded. He has won so many awards, so I just mentioned 6 Emmy Awards, right? 6. And 2 George Foster Peabody Awards and many others. So Thank you, Rick, for doing this tonight for us. It's a pleasure and it's incredibly exciting. We look forward to hear what he has to say about filming Dante, translating from poem into film language. The second person I want to introduce is Riccardo Bruscagli, who, if I am not wrong, is the initiator, right, of the project, I mean, in terms of the idea, together with Rick Burns. Riccardo Bruscagli is an Italian professor of Italian literature at the University of Florence. So, you know, no better place to be if you're a dentist, of course. He went from being a fellow of the renowned Italian scholar, literary scholar, right? Lanfranco Caretti was and until he was a dean in the university. He's an expert in Italian chivalric romances and Renaissance literature, has lectured at a number of universities I will not mention, but at least Columbia here, Berkeley, just to name two. In 2005, he inaugurated and promoted a very successful program at the Società Dantesca Italiana, Dante Leggere, to reintroduce Dante to the general public, which is something we're obviously sharing with him. And I just want to mention that he was the editor, published the edition of the Divine Comedy for Zanichelli in 2011 with a DVD and the first recording of the entire commedia by a pretty famous actor in Italy, who is Ivano Marescotti, one of my favorites, by the way. So thank you, Riccardo Bruscagli, for joining us here. I then move to the actors. And here we are, Antonio Fazzini. Probably those who have watched the documentary film recognizes Dante, big profile, right? Now with a beard, it's like but it's him, right? So he's a theater and film actor, collaborates with many, many things. He's also a singer and a dancer. Am I wrong? I saw that online. Yeah. Well, it's on your, I saw on your webpage. So I thought I would mention it because, you know, this is polymath, artistic polymath. I mean, it's great. Anyway, so he is working, let me mention this work that you are doing still now with Stefano Massini, very well known in Italy, as author and director. He has produced memoirs of The Executioner, The Definite Smell of White, Frankenstein, or Frankenstein, depending on what pronunciation you prefer. He also, I mean, it's a familiar face for those who were addicted to TV series, especially in Italian, because he starred in Fosca Innocenti, I've watched all of them. Allieva 3, Paradiso delle Signore, and your name. Let me mention his appearance in Fratelli Italiani, Maraviglioso Boccaccio, the wondrous Boccaccio. Some of my students will be watching it, so they will recognize you. So thank you, Antonio, for being here, for our Dante, for playing Dante with us. I move to Deacon Tulane, as I hope I pronounced the... Okay, great. Deacon is Virgil, the serious Virgil in the Dante film. He was born in London, but lived in Iraq, Trinidad, and the US until he was 19, then returned to London to go to drama school. He worked in London, regional theater, for a decade, then came back to New York, Miss New York, right? And then in Atlanta. And he did a lot of Shakespeare, and here began in film, right? Not in the UK. And he went back, and for those, again, addicted to TV series, he's a well-known face for those who have watched The Blacklist. I watched all 9 seasons, so it's great. But Night Agent, and obviously, lastly, Dante, Inferno to Paradise. Thank you very much, Deacon, for playing Virgil and for being here. Finally, Alan Katz is the narrator. the warm, deep voice that accompanies the vision of the film. Alan has had a long career on stage, and it's a familiar face, of course, for the many things he has starred in. He started very, very young in the young Sherlock Holmes, which I watched, and I recognized you. You were 14, playing the very young Dr. Watson, right? And then he studied at Atlanta with his father, and then joined the Royal Shakespeare Company. He had several productions at the National Theatre and many other places. I will not tell all of them, but I want to just to mention a translation in the US, the translation by Brian Friel on Broadway, and on a national tour of The Caretaker by Harold Pinter, as well as playing Claudius in Hamlet at the Shakespeare Theatre Company in Washington. So just mention in Phil, also Mrs. Dalloway, this is one of my favorite, The Good Wife, John Adams, and New Amsterdam, again, the 3 series that are, I watched all of them. So, fantastic. These people are fantastic, and thank you, Alan, for being here. And ora mi taccio, come direbbe il nostro. So let me introduce now, no more introduce, but Riccardo and Rick.
Rick and Rick.
Rick and Rick.
So what should we try? First, the microphone. Okay, is it audible? Okay. So somebody said that I was the initiator, I've been the initiator of this project. I don't know if this is correct, because this project came from many inspirations altogether, a conflation of many inspirations. Maybe the initiator was my wife Christine, who's there, because well, for a very simple reason, because she patiently listened to me through all those events at Teatro della Pergola in Florence when we tried to explain Dante to the masses. And the idea was that that type of Dante, that way of presenting Dante, which was, or tried to be scientifically rigorous, but at the same time affable and understandable and captivating, that was maybe the key to present Dante to a more general audience, even not just in Italian, but in English, which means to America, but also to the world, since English is the Latin of the planet. So, but naturally, that idea would have been, you know, sterile and or inefficient if, for a series of contacts through Jane Morrow, we hadn't met Rick Burns. Very briefly, for me to work with Rick Burns was a great adventure. My experience doing this movie with him was that I was investigated implacably by one of the, I can tell you now, I never told you in private, but I can tell you in public, by one of the most brilliant brains I ever met. And I met many in my life. And, but why? Because I came to from a place where I thought I owned Dante. I am Italian. I'm an Italian professor at the University of Florence. I mean, Dante is in my veins. I breathe Dante. I've been breathing Dante since I was this small. So, I know Dante. I know Dante. And I take Dante for granted. At the university, I don't tend to explain why we teach Dante. We teach Dante because Dante is Dante. And all of a sudden, I had to, let's say, get out of my bubble of privilege and understand that I had instead to answer the continuous questions and investigations of this brilliant brain. Why Dante? How can we relate to Dante today? Why it is relevant for us? What does he have to tell you to us now in this very time? And I didn't have all the answers, and I had to reinvent my Dante for the movie. Because, and I'll be very brief, Dante, in the Convivio, in one of his prose masterpieces, at a certain point stated that poetry cannot be translated. He said that in a very, very sharp way. He says, words which are linked with a musical linkage cannot be translated into another language, which is true. Which is true. And we know that there are more than 100 translations in English of the Divine Comedy, but the language is another language. There's nothing to do. At the end of the fifth canto, e cadvi come corpo morto cade, there is no way that another language can recapture this domino effect of the key. Cadvi come corpo morto cade. There is no way. But that doesn't mean that you don't have to translate it. To translate it in a profound way, not just to translate it word by word, but to translate it into another culture, into another mentality, into another horizon of expectation. That has been my adventure in making this movie with Rick. And in doing so, you discover or rediscover a lot of things. To translate, in translation, you lost in translation, you lose something, but you also gain a lot. Exactly because now you have to explain to another mind, to another set of thought, what you really knew. I always make this example and then basta. Naturally, everybody knows and by heart the beginning of the Divine Comedy, no? Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai in una selva oscura che la diritta via era smarrita. I knew it. I knew it since I was in elementary school, and I took it for granted. But having to translate this beginning into the beginning of a movie where this verse should be the, I would say, the hook, the main attraction to the spectator to continue to watch the movie, I then understood the revolutionary character of those verses. Because there is no poem of high style that starts this way. The Aeneid by Virgil does not start that way, and not Dante didn't know Homer, but it's the same. At the beginning of the regular epic poems, naturally the poet introduces himself. I'm here, this is my subject, and he asks for help from the Muses and from Apollo, and then, no, Dante does not start his poem this way. Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva oscura. You are immediately pushed into a narrative situation of anxiety and fear. And who are you? Mi ritrovai. What's your name? Where do you come from? And only in that case, in that circumstance, I understood how incredibly new, how incredibly captivating and gripping was the beginning of the Divine Comedy. And only when we had to choose those verses for the beginning of our movie. So I'm here once again to, yeah? You're not, but I'm sorry to say I'm finished. So, so if you understood something, I'm grateful, but I won't repeat it in a different device. Okay. Okay, but for those who come after me, because I'm
Using the stage mics after this. We won't use that one anymore. We'll just use the stage mics. Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, I was about to finish with a firework of ideas, and they are gone now. But no, that was really just to say that I was saying that I'm really grateful to Steeplechase and to Rick in particular to have dragged me into this adventure, which taught to. I don't think I was presumptuous. I don't think I was, really in my ivory tower of my facoltà di lettere, thinking that I knew everything about Dante and what do they want, those Americans. That was not my attitude, but it really pushed me into a different space where I understood and enjoyed much more of Dante than I thought I would.
Okay, first of all, Bonnie, is that okay? Okay, how about this? Is that better? And could anybody turn that up, or is that loud enough, buddy?
It's better than the distortion.
What's that?
Speak loudly into that. It's better than
Okay, good. First of all, it's fantastic for me to be here. And I think the most important thing I have to start with is to explain why I have a Band-Aid on my head, which is because, and I'm very, very sorry for this, most people think it's because Bonnie, my wife, hit me on the head. But in fact, what happened was, for years, as Riccardo and I were working on this.
Come out from behind the podium, Rick.
What's that?
Come out from behind the podium.
Really?
Yes.
Really?
Get over
And
Phil
then,
Donahue.
what's that? Okay, gosh, like Phil Donahue, rest in peace. Riccardo and his wife, Chris, really wanted us to include in our film, from Canto 21 of Inferno, the farting devils, Malacoda in particular. And I said all along, we would definitely have in the film a major scene on the farting devils. And in the end, we didn't. And when Riccardo suppressed his anger for a very long time, but when he saw me this time, he hit me over the head with a translated copy of the Divine Comedy. 7 dissolving stitches were required, and I realized I was humbled by the whole thing. So that gets rid of the Band-Aid. I want to thank so many people just really, really briefly. Riccardo, Chris, Herring, Jane Morrow, who kind of married us all together, Bonnie, who's our producer, Lee Howell, who's our producer, Bonnie LaFave, our incredible cinematographer, Buddy Squires, who's here. Just Buddy, you made the film. Dickren, your Virgil is so fantastic from my point of view. Antonio, what people now say is, isn't it incredible how much Dante looks like Antonio? Not the other way around. Of course, Susanna and Angela for having us here. Alan Cox is such an extraordinary actor and has played multiple roles, many of them not seen, in terms of how we sort of wrote the film and thought about the film, and has brought so much intelligence to our narration. It's impossible for me to separate the film from both your performance as Boccaccio and from your narration. I want to get back to Riccardo Bruscagli at the end of my remarks and try to keep them, but sort of put a pin in Riccardo for a second. When Riccardo, via Jane, brought us the project, and we instantly said we want to do this. T.S. Eliot I'm a major fan of T.S. Eliot, for whom Dante was the greatest of all. And Eliot said this sort of amazing thing about exactly 100 years ago about Dante, which is that, in addition to using the lingua franca, which was, at the time, Florentine, the Florentine dialect, which became Italian itself over the course of centuries. But that he also said that he was a great poet of vision, by which he said, Eliot, that he was a visionary. And he wrote at a time when visions were something people still had. And they were part of the normal discourse and understanding of human reality is to have visions. And of course, Divine Comedy is this extraordinary vision. And that idea that the visible and sight is sort of another lingua franca that may even be a higher lingua franca than the language itself. Because we all sort of, no matter what language we speak, we all see in the same language. And that the Divine Comedy is so, in addition to being highly formal and terza rima and rhymes of three and, you know, sort of a symmetry of cantos within each part, under cantos altogether, that nevertheless, you know, it's also so visual. You start seeing it from the beginning. You know, in the middle of the journey of our life, I found myself within a forest dark, for the straightforward pathway had been lost. So there's almost everything in the poem is something which you can see, which means that I felt right away that the Divine Comedy was maybe a kind of documentary film in which you were seeing what was an autobiographical reality that Dante had gone through, filled with people he knew and people he had read about, and his own, you know, from start to finish. And in addition to that, because it's sort of like someone once said, Gerard Lukács, that this was the last epic poem in the first novel, that there was this powerful way in which, since Dante appears immediately as the character in his own work. I mean, there's Dante the narrator, Dante the author who's writing about it, and then Dante in the poem. And that therefore, not only was it visual, but you could have a Dante, you would want to see Dante. And then Virgil, who he finds in the dark woods. So it seemed natural, not only to sort of try to make an English translation of it, but to make a sort of a documentary film translation of it in which you could have a Dante and be with him and in his journeys and meet Beatrice finally at the end of Purgatorio. So that was really the kind of the origin point of the film for me. And then we sat down, and I have to say, Riccardo, it's okay about my head. But our partnership in this was just so extraordinary for me. And we worked tirelessly and endlessly to try to figure out what the story would be. All the scenes that were included were we couldn't do 100 cantos. It was really Riccardo's sense of which parts should be used. Riccardo, who found at least 2/3 of the scholars and knew personally the scholars we interviewed. Riccardo, who knew that the only place in the world that could seem like the mountain of purgatory was the marble quarry of Carrara. So we filmed out there. And so he brought this kind of natural sense with not a grain of pretension and such an enormous erudition, two things that don't usually go together, unpretentiousness and vast erudition. So that it was just extraordinary. And I'm really so grateful to you, Riccardo, for having, sort of put up with the process and joined it at the level that you did. And what we decided, thinking about all the elements that I've talked about, the kind of autobiographical element, the fact that there's a Dante character in there as well as Dante the narrator, and we decided so that there was interplay of sort of imagination and reality in this text, which was so resoundingly new that we decided we would create 3 strands and interbraid them in the course of our 4-hour film, 2-part, 4-hour film. And that one strand would be biographical. Who Dante was, where he had come from, you know, how he was exiled from Florence, how he started to write the poem, where and when he died, etc. Another strand would be deep inside his work itself, sort of following the narrative of the Divine Comedy from beginning to end. And the third strand, sort of more abstract sounding than those first two, would be what we called the story of the text. Where the hell did this thing come from? What precedents could there be for it? How and when did he begin to write it? How did it unfold? What happened to it during his lifetime? How did he finish it? And what was its legacy over the last 700 years? And those were the three strands that we sort of crafted. It didn't make itself at that point, but once we had that sense of what it should be, that's where we and how we put it together. So what tonight we're going to do is show 3 clips from the film. The introduction to the first of the 2 parts, then a very short scene from within it, and then the introduction to the second part, at which point Angela, Susanna will kind of like throw it open to everybody and have a kind of a free-for-all. Okay. Susanna, I trust you to, having you showed me how to do this. Oh, that's right, thank you. Then there's that. Then there we go. So you showed me. Okay, could we dim the lights, please?
Right. Dim the lights. It's probably maybe something we have to do from the podium. If you would like to go there.
There, thank you so much.
Okay, maybe it's too much. Is it too much?
I don't think so. Oops.
It makes sense, yes. Or even
Hold on, and then. It's either this or all off.
All. Thank you.
Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva oscura che la diritta via era smarrita. Midway upon the journey of our life, I found myself within a forest, dark, for the straightforward pathway had been lost. Ah me, how hard a thing it is to say. What was this forest? Savage, rough, and stern. The very thought of which renews the fear. So bitter is it, death is little more. But of the good to treat, which there I found. Speak will I of the other things I saw there.
He had been on the run for nearly 4 years, moving almost constantly from place to place, across the rough mountain high country, above the Tuscan plains, finding refuge when he could, with powerful families sympathetic to his plight, then moving on. When sometime in the spring of 1306, he came to a remote castle high in the mountains of the Lunigiana, a wild region far north and west of his native city of Florence. Neutral territory that for years had hosted refugees from both sides of the savagely warring factions of his fiercely divided city. How long he remained there is unclear. A year perhaps, maybe more. But it was almost certainly there, sometime in the winter of 1306, that the beleaguered 41-year-old exiled poet set to work on an epic poem that he had been revolving in his mind for some time. A monumental work that he would wrench from himself under the worst possible circumstances, that would take him the rest of his life to complete, that would in the end make his name one of the most famous and universally recognized in the history of world culture, and itself be acclaimed as arguably the greatest single work of literature ever created in the Western world. The Divine Comedy.
The Divine Comedy begins with a midlife crisis. A man at 35 years old, in the fiction of the work, Dante himself, who at a certain point wakes up, looks around, doesn't recognize the landscape, the physical landscape, and the moral landscape around him. And this is a moment of fracture in his existence, and it is a moment of fracture which implies naturally not only his private life, but the life around him, which makes no sense anymore.
Dante knows he's writing something very different and very special, and the Divine Comedy is one of these books that are made every once in a while in human history.
Nothing quite like it had ever been written before. Narrated in the first person by Dante himself, no poem of its kind had ever started out with such startling and personal intensity, or brought individual human experience into such vivid and immediate relationship with forces far larger, or sought to encompass in its vast embrace the entire range of human experience. Chronicling an extraordinary pilgrimage through the three realms of the afterlife, Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, it will tell of a harrowing journey, of a descent into the depths of hell, of a subsequent ascent up through purgatory, and thence on to the farthest and most sublime regions of paradise itself. A heart-rending, intimate, and transcendent journey, at once fantastic and real, epic and personal, soaringly allegorical, and inexpressibly vivid.
This is a story that begins badly in hell and ends happily in heaven.
This is the journey from exile to homeland. This is the condition of humankind, exiled from God.
The experience of a medieval reader reading the poem would have been shocking. People would have not been expecting to find that strong individuality in a poem that is also meant to be a journey towards salvation and towards transcendence. Dante was certainly aware of doing something new.
Dante has made himself the subject of his literature. And so I think it's inevitable that one would ask, who really was Dante? What's really driving him?
The poem comes to us across an immense gulf of time, written more than 700 years ago by a proud, acutely sensitive, and fiercely ambitious self-taught poet and sometimes politician. Born in 1265, begun by its beleaguered author at his own moment of harrowing loss and dislocation. Far from home, on his own, with no way back. A wanderer, almost a beggar, he wrote at the time. Framed for a crime he didn't commit in 1302, and exiled on pain of death from the striving, fiercely divided city of his birth, never to return.
The whole project of the poem emerges from the wound of the exile and his reputation that has been ruined by this unjust banishment from his city.
He's alone, he's in danger, he can be killed by anybody out of Florence. He's supposed to be hanged or burnt if he goes back to Florence.
Dante wrenched his inimitable masterpiece into existence at a moment of supreme crisis and change, not only for himself, but for the wider world generally, as the feudal structures of the Middle Ages began to give way and a new modern world loomed into view. A world in which every aspect of the moral, political, social, religious, and economic order seemed to be changing and breaking apart, and nowhere more so than in Florence itself. A city long possessed, as Dante well knew, by at once the loftiest and the basest, the most creative and destructive human instincts and impulses.
The poem emerges from this moment of profound crisis. There's a political crisis at hand, intense, never-ending conflict and fragmentation. And Dante really believes that we're close to end times. There's the real urgency of now, this moment in which we have to act now.
Dante is faced with corruption, is faced with sinning, is faced with violence on the part of human beings against other human beings. And his reaction is not to accept that, but it's actually to portray, to depict it, and to show that there is another way.
The idea that one would write 100 cantos essentially about one's own spiritual journey, turning one's personal life into the model for all humanity. It's an act of huge arrogance and of huge ambition. And at the same time, Dante is trying to say that this is possible for everyone.
After all, the purpose of Dante's major work, a comedy, is to change the world. The purpose of showing the conditions of the damned in Inferno, or the conditions of the purging souls in Purgatory, or even the conditions of the blessed in Paradise, is for us, for human beings, to reform ourselves and our lives. Dante means it. Dante means what he writes. It is not a game.
For Dante himself, the experience of exile and of crafting the monumental poem would transform him utterly, exerting a powerfully centrifugal, ever-widening impact on his life, on his work, and on the vast posterity of readers he was determined the great poem would speak to.
You think about the exile and you think about all the hardships of what happened to him, the people that he was exposed to, and the languages and the stories. All he has, his very life, is consigned to this work. And he is putting it in a way on the line of writing and reading. And it's extraordinary.
He might have died along the way. As he says at the beginning of Paradiso 25, this poem, that made me macro, that wore me out, that consumed me. And there is a way in which you feel that that work, he took it to the end of his life and it was consuming.
At the very heart of Dante's extraordinary poem, propelling it onward from beginning to end, would be two powerful forces: the violently bitter hatred, factionalism, corruption and greed of his native city, which he longed to heal, and his love for an ineffably beautiful woman named Beatrice, a Florentine girl he'd met in childhood, who had died when she was 24, whom he would write passionately about all his life, and to whom he longed somehow to find a way to return.
One of the reasons why Dante writes this magnificent poem is to provide himself with a passport back to his home, to his beloved home, Florence. But the more he writes, the bigger the separation becomes, the bigger the difference becomes between him and Florence.
I don't think that the poem would have had its kind of power had he managed to stay in Florence. He also might not have written it, or not written it in the same way, if he were not in exile for Florence. In some ways, the poem becomes the homeland for him that the city is not. He actually creates in the poem his own home.
Perhaps in the interest of time, I'll skip over one scene so we can bring our interlocutors back to the stage. The first, and to most people who read the Dante in college, it's usually the Inferno and not anything else. The first part of our film is about, the circumstances of his life, how he was exiled from Florence, how he came to write the poem, and then the first notorious part or canticle of the poem, Inferno, which ends with Dante and Virgil climbing out of hell, having gone all the way down to the bottom and seen sort of every kind of sin and foible and weakness to which the flesh is prey. And then coming out to now begin the second part of their journey, and which is to climb Mount Purgatory on the other side of the world from where they had entered hell. And after that, in the third part, to continue on their way up to heaven, with Virgil now handing him over for that third part to this extraordinary woman who is like the girl next door, Beatrice Portinari, who turns out to have played this critical transforming role in his life and in his poetry. So I'll play now the introduction to part two. Imagine so far that you've been to hell and back, and perhaps, you already have been sitting here. But if we could turn down the lights again. Thank you, Suzanne.
Reader, do not ask of me how I grew faint and frozen. I cannot write it. All words would fall far short of what it was. I did not die, and I was not alive. Think for yourself, if you have any wit, what I became, deprived of life and death.
As Dante was finishing the Inferno, which was just the first part of his three-part epic poem, the Commedia, he'd been in exile for almost 7 years, forced from his beloved city of Florence, homeless. Being exiled in Dante's time is something we really can't comprehend fully now. Within the gates of this city was security. Alone, lost and uprooted, vulnerable. Dante had to keep moving. And the Commedia, his guide through the afterlife, it is because of his exile we get the gift of this poem, but it's a very painful condition from which he writes.
By the spring of 1307, 6 Easters had come and gone since Dante's exile had begun. 6 years of wandering, impoverished, unmoored, far from family and home, at constant risk. An itinerant beggar, he wrote, forced to rely on the mercy of the lords of the Tuscan high country for protection, and consumed now with the creation of a vast poem, unlike anything that had ever been written before. A poem which, he hoped, if he could only find a way to finish it, might serve to confirm his greatness as a writer and provide him with a passport which might carry him triumphantly home. The poem itself told of a fateful and phantasmagorical journey Dante had undertaken 6 years earlier, in the spring of 1300, before his woeful exile had begun. A journey that would take him through the 3 realms of the underworld and afterlife, from darkness to redemption. A journey that had itself started with haunting specificity 3 days before Easter, in the early hours of April 8, 1300, in the terrible darkness, anguish, and despair of Good Friday.
In the Divine Comedy, there is this crossing between the individual life of Dante and the collective life of Christianity. Because the week of Easter, which goes from the passion and crucifixion of Christ to his resurrection, is the crucial moment of the Catholic faith, the moment where you go from the bottom of destitution and desperation to the peak of hope and happiness. In this sense, the comedy reflects what happens during the week of Easter, which goes from the abyss of death and abandonment to the resurrection, to the new life of Easter Sunday.
Every spring, at Easter time in particular, the pain of his situation came over him acutely, along with an enormous longing to go home, to return to the city that had spurned him, to the great baptistry of St. John, the center of all that was good in Florence for Dante, the beating heart of all hope and love and renewal. A place that he wished to return to almost as much as he longed to find some way back to the hauntingly beautiful Florentine girl he had loved passionately since childhood, and who had died more than 15 years earlier, Beatrice.
For Dante, the notion of returning to Florence is something that looms so large for him. You know, he talks about going back to the baptistry of Florence, but already in terms where we know he suspects that may not be possible.
When Dante speaks of the baptistry, he calls it his beautiful San Giovanni, il bel San Giovanni. The baptistry was the most magnificent building in the city of Florence and perhaps in all of Tuscany. And Dante speaks of it as a place of identity. Dante's great ancestor, Cacciaguida, in the Divine Comedy very specifically says, in this place I became at the same time cacciaguida and a Christian. He might have added, I also became a Florentine, because all children born in Florence were brought here to be baptized. No other church had the privilege of being able to give the sacrament of baptism. And Florentines returned to this building on a number of important occasions. Every year in Dante's time, on the day when the church remembers the death of Christ, Good Friday, in Florence, all house fires were extinguished. The city went dark and cold on Good Friday and would remain so for 2 days until Holy Saturday, the day before Christ's resurrection. And when they begin to celebrate the signs of his resurrection, here in the baptistry, in the afternoon of Holy Saturday, they lit a bonfire inside the baptistry. If we imagine for a moment on what might be a dark spring day, a bonfire whose flames illuminate the glittering gold background mosaics and the then gleaming marbles, and from that bonfire, then, the flame for the Easter candle, the Paschal candle, which symbolizes Christ's resurrection, was taken. And from that same bonfire, the heads of all Florentine families came with little buckets to take ardent coals, to take them to their homes, to again light the fires that would make it possible to cook, to end the fast that began on Good Friday. And so the light and heat and warm food with which Florentines lived all year came from a fire that had been illuminated in this place of baptism, where as children they had been inducted into the hope of eternal life. This was a refining fire, it was a vital fire, it was in some way a symbol of the fire of the Holy Spirit, which consumes sin and which makes us, as it were, flaming torches, giving light and truth to others.
So on behalf of Susanna and Angela, I guess should everyone come back up on the stage? Curran, Alan, Riccardo, Antonio.
We're just going to put the key image back up.
Say it again.
We're just going to put the key image back up. So we're not looking at that.
How did you know how to do that?
Was the one thing I paid attention to in the beginning.
I'd like to thank Alison Cornish. We showed the entire film on Friday at the Casa Italiana at NYU downtown, which was really, I think for the filmmakers, you know, and the people in it, was really an experience of a lifetime. It may have been for the audience another kind of hell to watch 4 hours in one day, plus a panel, plus a piece from the cutting room floor. But thank you so much. It meant everything to us. Yep, thank you.
Yeah, for some people, it's been all Dante all the time for the past 3 days, which is great. Wouldn't have it any other way. It was beautiful and wonderful and powerful to hear from both Rick and Riccardo about their own experience of thinking about Dante differently in order to prepare to create this beautiful film that we've seen. So I wanted to engage our actors in the conversation as well, to ask a question that both of them actually have answered. I don't know what your conception of Dante was before you got involved with this project, but would you mind saying a couple of words about how your sense of Dante and your relationship to Dante and to the Commedia may have been altered, may have changed as a result of participating in this project?
Thank you. I'll start. As Riccardo said before, for an Italian, it was a completely different approach because we generally take Dante for granted in Italy, no? So you think you understand in depth some meaning of Dante. Working on the translation and working on this thing to make people who don't speak Italian understand in depth Dante, it has changed something for me. And now I know Dante much better, and it's been a very great experience. And I must thank Riccardo, and all the incredible people who participate to this production, Steeplechase, and all the stuff. It's been a very, very incredible experience. I think my colleagues agree with me.
It might be at the bottom.
No. Yeah.
Okay.
So I had no references, really. I mean, I'm a Shakespeare boy. But I did, once we started, and even more like seeing it after we started, I had this thing of C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and Quest and all those sorts of things, which I guess I always thought C.S. Lewis was pagan. They had to tell me later on what it was all about. So I was thinking, the only thing I had was just these wonderful pieces of chunks of stuff to speak, which I sort of ran over on the plane, and I was working on it. And it seemed that Virgil was, in the story, he's the guide and he's the pagan. And he's the ancient. And he has a sort of slightly kind of, you'll be all right, son, attitude to this brave quester. That was the thing for me, and that was just immediate, because, like I said, I didn't have any deep background in the work, so I like it a lot more than I did. I like it a lot more than I did before I started. So yeah.
Like Dickren, I'm a Shakespeare boy. And I first got to know the Divine Comedy through a Naxos audiobook reading by the poet Heathcote Williams. And anybody who's ever seen Derek Jarman's film of The Tempest will have seen Heathcote playing Prospero in that. So, and he had a knack. It wasn't a particular, I don't know whose translation it was, but Heathcote himself was a poet. And like many actors, he had a knack of finding a poetic phrase within this prose which wasn't particularly metrical. But as a Shakespeare boy, it was fascinating listening to the Dante in Italian the other afternoon, and hearing that, the Shakespeare default is iambic pentameter, and hearing these 10-beat lines but with feminine endings, and it made me think that, like to be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, or by opposing end them. That sense, that particular bit of Shakespeare with feminine endings gives you a sense that it's rolling over, that he hasn't quite arrived at a conclusion, or hasn't arrived at the axis of his antithesis.
So there was some talk the other day about you can't appreciate Dante until you've read it in the original Klingon. And that there is something that language is a medium between one thing and another. And poetic language, very kind of concise language, which is fascinating about Rick's voiceover, is it's incredibly dense. But if you bring your kind of Shakespeare toolkit to it, you try and rattle through as much as possible without overemphasizing or extracting too many evocative adjectives, for instance. You let the language do the work, as you're kind of taught to do. So I find that sense of the evolution and the search for many great English poets to try and deliver an English language version of Dante. And what I'm so happy about with the documentary is you get a sense of the original language. You get the images, and this is the other thing I think particularly interesting in that you know, storytelling in translation works in images more than in symbols. Symbols is almost like a hidden code book. People go, I know what this means this means a tree is a penis, a cave is a vagina. And you go, yeah, all right, maybe a bit. But that, so images have their own life. It's like in Beckett, you know, that you can't decode an image with a sort of an extrapolation. You kind of go, there it is, what does it yield in you? What yields in you when you appreciate it? And that's what I love about the kind of, the montage of influences to communicate this epic masterpiece in Rick's hands. I'm a Shakespeare boy.
Well, as T.S. Eliot once said, the world is divided in two, Shakespeare and Dante. Right. There is no third. So obviously, this is the case here. And just, I want to do a follow-up question. You mentioned influence, this question of influence, and you also mentioned this poetry that we're accustomed to hearing. So I was very interested to know which translation you chose to use in doing, you know, obviously there's so many to choose from, so which one and why? And then also, in terms of this influence of imagery, are there filmmakers or poets or artists who visually were present to you as you were creating this this visual masterpiece that you're making in film?
Well, thank you for everyone for the kind comments. Can you hear me okay? There were no translations into English until about the turn of the 18th, 19th century. So for hundreds of years, essentially, Protestant English culture sort of sneered, at least linguistically, at Dante, even if he was celebrated amongst sort of the literati, even in England. And then something began to change in the late 18th, early 19th century, and from 1800, roughly 1802, there have now been, we say in the film, 109 translations into English. That number is already obsolete. There have probably been 3, 4, 5 more since we said there were 109. Out of those 109, we chose to focus on 2. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow was the first American English translation. He began it in 1863 during the Civil War, finished it in 1867. And it has a kind of a sound to it which is poetic in the extreme, and sometimes it'll sound a little bit quaint to contemporary ears, but we chose, you know, to use his translation of the opening lines. You know, in the middle of the journey of our life, I found myself within a forest dark, for the straightforward pathway had been lost. That's Longfellow. And if you used the other translation, which we found fantastic, Alan Mandelbaum's translation, which was done in the 1970s and early 80s, which is extraordinary. If you used his opening lines, you'd be so displeased at some level. So what we did is we kind of like toggled back to Longfellow at times, cheated a little bit and did a little bit of our own translating, but mainly relied on Alan Mandelbaum's incredible translation. Both of these translations are the translations included in Teodolinda Barolini's Digital Dante, which is possibly the greatest single resource for Dante. It's online, it's free, it has the entire poem, it has it read in Italian, it has it read it has the translation by Longfellow, has the translation by Mandelbaum, has commentary by Teo Barolini, and it's just really quite extraordinary as a resource. So most of what we use is, when we're not on occasion leaning back into the Italian, is from Mandelbaum's incredible translation, because there's a kind of, it's almost beyond musicality. He sort of gets the inner sense of it rhythmically, narratively, and so after a while, as an English person, you can be just really hypnotized by it.
Thank you. And the second question is the visual imagery. What did you have? Filmmakers, artists who were your inspiration for some of the visual imagery?
In terms of the visual imagery and where that came from, you know, I think it's such a amalgam of everything I've had the good fortune of learning about filmmaking and the visual, of which, for example, what Buddy you shot. I mean, we've been working together, you've worked together with Ken since you both were coming out of Hampshire College in the mid-1970s. And I inherited my relationship to you from that relationship you had with Ken. I mean, your parents gave you a camera when you were 14 years old, I think. So you've been filming a long time, and what's amazing about what you do is that you're always, each time it's new. Each time, you know, you bring no arrogance, just depth to what you do. And I think among the things that I would feel fortunate to have learned is that, first of all, film needs to be like a waking dream. You're fully conscious, but it's creating this effect, sort of like the way Jack Nicholson in The Shining seems to be sort of, when the going gets really tough, he's kind of there, but he's not there. He's like halfway hypnotized. And that's when you get really scared of him. And so there's that quality of waking dream, which you're always trying to have it be visually, no matter what the visual is, even an on-camera, you know, interviewee talking. And what it all has to be obedient to is that at every moment of a film, visually and otherwise, you have to sense deeply and in a kind of a tactile way that there's something more than what you're actually seeing and actually hearing. If you were ever to be caught in a moment where what you're seeing and hearing is fully exhausted by what you're seeing and hearing, it's boring beyond belief. That what you need to be doing is constantly having people both understand what they're seeing, but also wondering what it is that what you're seeing is related to that's not there. And that kind of very basic rule of visualization, where it's both dreamlike and that there's always something more than what you're seeing and hearing, is the rule. And I feel like then what's different about any particular film comes from the content. Like you constantly want to be listening to the content of a person's life, of the work they did, so that your form and style of the film emerges entirely from the material that you're working on. I don't know if that makes sense, but.
Just really a footnote to explain also, just really a small thing about the movie. that there is not so much of it in the sequences that we saw, but there was a very exhausting, long, sophisticated work by Rick and by the squires and other cinematographers with original manuscripts, illustrated manuscripts of the Divine Comedy. When you see images from the manuscripts of the Divine Comedy, they are not from the internet. They are from the real things. So we filmed in the Vatican, we filmed in the Riccardiana, we filmed in the Laurenziana, and we filmed in the Archivio di Stato. When you see the figurine of Dante indicating that is not from internet, that was from the Archivio di Stato. And that does not appear in the movie. There is nobody saying, oh, you know, we were in the Vatican and we. But I think that how can I say, the intimacy of those images, the way the narration enters those images, and maybe also the rarity of those images, could speak of the hard work that is behind the movie, not only especially, but really from a figurative point of view, from the point of view of the visual imagery.
Thank you. In part, you already answered, because that was my question about the material, the manuscripts that you were using, not only about, you know, the manuscripts themselves, but even in terms of locations. I was curious if you could talk a little bit about that. And visual, I would add also the tradition. There is a lot of films, right, that have been made since 1911, I think. Oh, no, actually, there is Conte Ugolino, 1908, which is, I think, the first one. I was wondering, that kind of visual, I mean, the film, have you related, have you used that? Because tell me if I'm wrong, but aren't scenes from the 1911 film there embedded? Yes, I thought I recognized them. And so I wanted to know if you could tell something about it, your decision to use them in this way, and you know what it means in the movie. And also for the actors, whether you looked at the other films that have been made on Dante, if you had any model, if you, I don't know, I mean, how you used these other materials visually on film.
Okay, do we start with the second question first? Yeah. Antonio.
If I use some, well, in Italy we are bombed with images and clips and videos about Dante. So I can tell if there's something that I refer to exactly. There are a lot of material for me to, which I refer to, but not something specific.
So for interpreting your Dante, you read the Commedia more than watched the other movies or other interpretations?
Yes, that's what I generally do. I don't like to watch other interpretation before I make a character. I like to give my own view of that character in general, not only for this film. Okay.
Yes, I remember Peter Greenaway's TV Dante, if anyone remembers that, which had John Gielgud playing Virgil and Bob Peck playing Dante. And it was, he obviously had all the toys at his disposal. And so, yes, I'm an actor, so I don't really need any of this sort of visual stuff. I've just got to get the words out. But particularly for Bob Peck and John Gielgud, them as exponents of the spoken word, John Gielgud in a very kind of high rhetorical style, and Bob Peck in a very kind of demotic, direct style. I wouldn't say I studied them in order to kind of do my job, but what I loved about when I was wading through the text and trying to lift it, thinking about how the great actors I admire handle language. And I particularly found the TV Dante that Greenaway did enjoyable to draw some inspiration from.
I don't think I have anything. I mean, it was really fun to watch it because I'm going, it's so much better than what I thought. You know, because it's like it's deeply sensual. It's music, marvelous faces. This is a marvelous face, you know, like the original, and so. I don't know. I guess maybe I don't really work. It does make me think of one thing, though. There's a book that's for some reason they say it's a young adult thing. It's The Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula Le Guin, which I read at a midpoint in my life, and it's very. Like this. It's this quest. It's a chap on a journey influenced by, you know, what happens around him, you know, a course of a life. And I feel like that story is, they're the big stories. They're the biggest stories, I think. And those I remember from being a kid all the way through reading The Wizard of Earthsea. And then for them, there's my own movie. I made my own movie of Lord of the Rings long before, what's his name? So that's, you know, that's... What's his name?
Peter Jackson.
Who?
Peter Jackson.
Peter Jackson. Peter Jackson.
You know, I like, Dickren, what you said. In the course of this movie, our movie, 4 hours long, it's astonishing how much time really 4 things are present, and it's really 3. One is Alan's narration, so it's a voice. We see you later in the film, as Book had shown. But how much time is spent looking at Antonio, watching him, thinking about what he's thinking, where he is inside on the basis of what you're seeing on the outside. And Dickren, for heaven's sake, how much time we spend looking at you, sort of second only to Antonio. And what's amazing is that Antonio, and I don't mean it to sort of downplay the extraordinary nature of your performance, but you're meant to be someone who's alive. Dickren is somebody who's been dead for 1,300 years. And you had to be both, you know, talk about that kind of double Jack Nicholson thing. You had to be both incredibly there and connected to Dante, to Antonio, but you had to have been dead for 1,300 years. And there's a line that Dante has in the early part, you know, where when he first sees you, Virgil, he says that your voice has been affected by the long silence. And you managed to create for us a Virgil who had been so transformed by the long silence. Because it wasn't as if you were traipsing around doing this all the time. Beatrice had sent you to get Dante out of the dark forest. That was, as far as I know, the first kind of like, you know, assignment of that kind you'd ever had. You hadn't been outside hell. There you were, you know, in the dark forest, which is not in hell. And I just wanted to say that between what you brought in that respect. Go ahead.
Well, the story that that reminds me of, she's the anima, right?
What's that?
She's the anima.
Right.
And then I have this story about, I'm not a God person either. So I have this story about what might be the source of that, which is the animus, which is the shadow male. the shadow male that men will have, that they'll conjure as a guide. That's it. That's what I thought he was. He's a ghost and he's a shadow. And because I'm short-sighted, I take my glasses off and that happens on screen.
I noticed you didn't wear your glasses during the film that much.
Yeah, it's lucky, huh? Yeah, that's it.
Antonio, I was amazed how you could just be Dante with words, but much more often just with how you looked, how you wrote, how you shivered in bed, how you just was wondering. I mean, you'd done Dante before, you were brought by Riccardo into this, conspiracy. But I just was wondering what, how you felt about, that process of just being Dante.
Dante. Well, what can I say? It was also natural. I mean, there was a lot of work in advance, with work of preparation of the character, and then when we were on the set, everything came. I don't want to say easy because it was not easy, but it was natural, sort of natural. How the work. Maybe, I don't know if my colleagues agree with me. It was a sort of creative process that was happening the minute we were shooting. And this is something that never happened to me. I don't know if you agree with me. It's been very interesting, challenging, but very interesting. And thank you, Rick.
There's a thing which your old college is very good about the inner life, and that, if from a Stanislavski training where you go, what's going on inside you if you haven't got any words, and that quality, and then also the way that the camera is catching the situation between the two of you, if you're in the foreground or the background, and that quality of, that's the fun of dressing up and play acting, is that you could get into this situation and be open to it. But then the thing that gives you some kind of gravity within the given set of circumstances is the knowledge where the character is now, with a sense of where they come from and what their intentions are about the future. So, actors talking about their preparation can sound a little bit, oogly boogly, but that basic thing of just an inner life in a certain situation, the things you don't say that are in tension with how you express yourself, is part of the work. And it's very easy when your workplace is evocative and stimulating to your imagination.
Yeah, that's right.
For being very cold. And also, those extraordinary locations. You just go, just be in that location and wear the costume and don't make it any more complicated.
Could I?
It must have been even more challenging for his character. I don't know, but you had to play two Dantes, right? The real one, the exile, and
But also, I just have to say,
and the character who is the president in the Commedians.
But you're like Indiana Jones.
You
You're wearing
were never really
like it's the most
there.
natural thing
You
in the
were
world.
always displaced in two different dimensions, right? At the same time.
We're saying
That's my job.
things. I'm giving you a very banal compliment. She's giving you a very profound compliment. I think it looks like a
Thank you
cowboy.
for detecting that.
I'll take them all.
What's he called? The guy in Kung Fu. What's his, David Carradine in Kung Fu. Yeah, you were like that. In a good way.
I think maybe we could
Absolutely.
ask the audience if they would like to ask questions to all of you. Any question you might be asking, anything you may want. Yes.
I'm thinking about another Italian, maybe within 500 years after the creation of Divine Comedy, is there a parallelism, maybe particularly with the Inferno part of Divine Comedy, and what Vico writes in the New Science about the second barbarism?
I think that's a really brilliant thing.
No, I think I don't, I'm not sure that I understood exactly what you expect from us as a response, but certainly Vico had this function, let's say, in rehabilitating every sort of non-classical poetry. Every poetry which was, because for him, naturally, poetry belongs to the childhood of humanity. Only when you're a child, you see things through visions and imagination. Then the age of reason comes in, and you lose that poetic imagination. And so he equals famously the childhood of humanity to the poetic season of humanity and to the barbaric time of historic development. And yes, he was seminal in tuning the sensibility of people with that kind of barbarism that Dante was. Dante was not liked by the classicism of the Renaissance, or even of the, not to mention the French, who said, or even Goethe, who said that the poem was incomprehensible. Somebody who wrote the second part of the Faust should be silent about it. And Vico instead rehabilitated that kind of barbaric, wild, imaginative poetry against the elegance of classicism. So yes, there was a rupture there which was essential in shifting the general sensibility towards poetry in general.
Speaking of the barbaric and the wild, so why didn't the fart scene get into the film?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned that. Did you actually film it, or did it not get that far?
We did it. I mean, and Alan was just, we did this thing where Alan looked straight into the camera. It was one of the few scenes where it was like that. And did this, like, I mean, it is a manic, wild scene. And we were filming in the Società Dantesca in Florence. And it was so good. So here's what really pisses me off. You know, long ago, PBS used to have this thing, which, you know, the PBS logo would come up and says, you know, if PBS doesn't do it, who will? And what I want to say to PBS is, they have gotten to be such sticklers for like beginning and ending, on the clock. And it's insane. If your film needs to have farting devils in it, you need the time for it. There are speeches from Beatrice that had to go. There are whole things that had to go so that it fit 2 1 hour and 53-minute sections. Now, on the one hand, reckless people like myself need constraints so that you can, you know, in the end, I mean, there has to be some limit. But what I know is that this film wants to have about 25 to 40 minutes more in it. And I can tell you, like, you can see a scene where Antonio is doing this incredible performance in which, you know, Dante meets Mosca de Lamberti. How could Mosca de Lamberti not be in this film? The inciting incident of Florentine division. But you see it for a moment just kind of used as kind of like just visual, where he's like, you know, so powerfully in there. But that scene needs to be there. Brunetto Latini. That had to go for time, but also because how could you have a scene in a film on public television in which a homosexual is a sodomite is found in hell. But at the same time, Dante is, loves him and is tender towards him. But that's a kind of thing which would be so complicated to have in the film. So I feel sorry for that. And it's just, in the end, I had to surrender.
Did we have other questions? Can you manage shouting?
I'm loud enough. I was wondering if Dante was aware of Ovid.
Aware of Ovid.
Yeah. Actually, probably after and there is certainly Dante shaped his mythology of exile on Ovid, and Ovid was probably I would say maybe the third: Virgil, Stazio, and Ovid. But Ovid was incredibly influential in Dante in many ways. The imagery, especially the sense of metamorphosis in Inferno, and you are right, the mythology of the exile, because Dante was never technically exiled. Dante was first confined, then he was not exactly exiled. The fact is that if he entered the territory of the Republic, he would be decapitated. So he was not condemned to, okay, we condemn you to the exile in this place in Ponto for a certain number of years. No, it was not that, technically. And then we know that he refused the amnesty. So the only one time that it was offered to him, so he condemned himself. He constructed, especially in his letters, let's say the mythology of himself as an exiled citizen, absolutely having in his mind Ovid and the mythology of the exile of Ovid. Because it was not, exile didn't exist in the legislation of Florence in those years.
But knowing that your head was going to be cut off or that you were going to be burned at the stake,
yeah, you stay away.
Really has a way of focusing your mind about where you do and don't want to be.
Yeah.
Which happens first?
So one or two more?
Yes. Just a brief comment that I thought that you should release an extended director's cut. My wishful thinking.
It's so. The idea of a director's cut, it's really, Bonnie feels this as well, that we need to, Bonnie LaFave, who's a senior producer in the film, and with Lee Howell, that there really needs to be a more extended cut. I mean, screw it, So we'll do it and then try to get PBS to shoehorn it in. I do want to say something to what you had said, Susanna, about the 1911 film, and also about sort of the visual style, which kind of when we use this incredible, I mean, the Inferno, the 1911 film, is just astonishing. And even though it was made in Italy, it's not in Italian because it's a silent film, so anybody can watch it. And it's just the first part, but it's really quite extraordinary where it gets you to. And so what we did corruptly is we took it and then did really extensive kind of animation of it so that it had a certain kind of depth that you couldn't have in a black and white film made in 1911, and also kind of a distortion of the imagery. Things were kind of more light, and sometimes, so that when Dante sees the three beasts that keep him from escaping from the dark forest, those beasts are actually taking what that film did. They're scarier in our kind of, metamorphosed version of it. And in doing that, we were doing something which Buddy would do all the time, which is that, there's a thing called rack focusing, where you kind of bring something into focus and then you lose focus and you come back and it's sharp again. And in so much of the cinematography, there's a kind of a motion of focus that's taking place so that your eye and your mind and your heart behind it, hopefully, are like following the narrative of, oh, that's coming into focus. and then it's losing it again. And often that kind of blurriness, which we added to the 1911 film, would be added by almost invariably shooting when we were inside through heat, so that there were heat ripples coming up through, so you could see the atmosphere, which was also sort of blurring and distorting the image. And I can't tell you how much, in my view, that affects the aesthetic of the film. That you really, it just takes you someplace you wouldn't be. In any case, I just wanted to say, bravo, buddy.
So we're close to 7:30, so should we do one more question?
One thing you didn't cover, but is so relevant, and I just wondered if it was the two Ricks who did it. In films, you have coaches, dialect coaches, etc. Was there a faith or spiritual coach or theological expert that kept you in the marvelous space where it's historical, it's a poem, it's ancient, but we're living it today? Just as you said, so much of the film you wanted us to feel that. So Catholicism then, now, here at Fordham, etc. Was there someone who guided you? Was it just the two Ricks?
It was really Riccardo. I mean, most of the stuff, I mean, there was the kind of team of scholars, you know, who we had on camera, and in some sense, I want to say, at our disposal. That was amazing, but Riccardo was really, you know, he was our Virgil. He was the one who was showing the way. And what was amazing is, like, I suspect Riccardo may not be an atheist. I am very definitely an atheist. But this is not a gotcha film. This is not like an expose. Hi, I'm an atheist. I'm going to do a film about this religious guy, so I have all these things to expose about what that means. On the contrary, it was, for me, this kind of journey into it. So there's not a moment of any doubting of faith. The only thing we might doubt or be angry about is the same things Dante was, because every pope in the poem is in hell. Now, having said that, he really was, you know, an extraordinarily devout person, but he wanted to make sure that just because you had the office, you did not have the authority to behave like an asshole. And that therefore you wanted to separate the person from the office and make sure that every time the person had, and that's why the church was so angry at him in return, because he was going like, yeah, I want the church. I just need to have good people, virtuous people in these offices. Otherwise, we're all screwed. And I only learned that, including the bad language, from Riccardo. So what do you have to say?
No, first of all, I have to correct. I mean, all the popes are in hell, but one who's in purgatory. But there is not one in paradise. No pope in paradise. There's just Adriano IV in purgatory, who was pope for a very brief time, by the way. And no, we didn't have any. Actually, at a certain point, we asked Ravasi, who's quite sophisticated mind, a cardinal now, to participate, and he declined, but not because we felt that we needed, let's say, I don't know how to say, the ecclesiastical sanction to the movie or the expert on theology, but just because he was another intelligent mind to take advantage of. And no, well, about our religious persuasions after the panel, okay?
Well, I did think it was interesting that one of the beautiful clips that you showed this evening was Bishop Verdon, who spoke so beautifully about the lighting of the fire in the baptistry and that tradition. And one of the things that we're reminded of is Dante's poem is grounded in this very beautiful, powerful religion that is full of these rituals. And so the Catholic, I mean, this is such a thoroughgoingly Catholic poem that it's, and I also love the critic commentator who says, you know, Dante's not playing a game.
Right, yeah.
This is about, this is your
But I
saving
must-
your soul.
I must say, if I can interject that, I think Rick agrees with me that when we thought of this movie about Dante, actually you cannot ignore his culture, which is so deeply imbued with the Catholic faith, etc. But we didn't have in mind a Catholic audience or a religious audience as our, target. We wanted actually to bring Dante to everybody because we thought that in the message of Dante, there was space really for everybody. And to find, let's say in a banal way, the human in Dante, also because his take on religion, even on the dogma, he's so easily translatable into human. What he says about paradise in Paradise 14, about what expects us with the resurrection of the souls, of the flesh. Okay, oh no, who cares? I'm sorry. I mean, I don't know how many of us here believe in the final resurrection of the flesh, but the way he turns this dogma, we could be also very abstract and into what? Into nostalgia for our bodies, and into the desire of seeing not just ourselves, but our dear ones in their own unique and unforgettable faces. And that is Dante. And that's why he surpasses, in a way, his own ideology.
Very beautiful. Well, this is, I don't know if this is working. We can do this all night, but we do understand that people have to get home and get to dinner and make their trains and their buses. So we are so grateful at the Curran Center, at Fordham Reads Dante, at Fordham University to have this amazing panel, to have this beautiful film that has been brought to our attention this evening. And we're very grateful for everyone for taking the time out to spend several hours with us. We're grateful to all of you for coming and listening and being part of this conversation. Look for the possibility of the Dante film coming back maybe in the spring on PBS, right, just in time for Easter, and maybe with the farting scene in it again. One can only hope. So please join me in once again thanking Rick and Riccardo and our actors.